An Italian man sets himself on fire and jumps off a 7th-story balcony. But he's not depressed and he has no debts or problems. Why did he do it? You may have heard of the so-called divine incense discussed in the 3rd book of the ancient Hindu Sagathas. According to the legend told in the Sagathas, the odour of this incense is so enchanting that anyone who once inhales it is doomed to spend the rest of his life scouring the Hindu Kush for its source. Some say the source of the incense was the same plant referred to in the Vedas as the source of Soma. Others claim the source of the incense was a tree which grows only in certain foothills of the Karakoram range. Some modern scholars say the incense, if it truly existed, was extracted from a rare lichen that grows in that region. Back in 1996, I was a young man looking for adventure, and my acquaintance Marco told me of this legend and persuaded me that we should attempt to find this incense. His theory was that there were likely villages dotted here and there in the Karakoram where the elders knew of this incense. I won't recount my travels with Marco here. What I will say is that as Marco and I slogged our way from one tiny village in the middle of nowhere to another, the conviction grew on me that Marco was an incorrigible fantasist. With him, the line between fantasy and reality was blurry and easily dismissed as a trifling irrelevance. Eventually, of course, we gave up our quest, having collected some interesting incenses, but nothing that fitted the effulgent descriptions given in the Sagathas. I returned to my medical studies in Edinburgh, and Marco returned to his hometown of Trieste in the northeast of Italy. I didn't see Marco again for more than 2 decades, but he did sometimes send me a letter, or later on, an email. We always seemed to be on the verge of meeting up for old time's sake while never actually managing it. Typically, he contacted me with a proposal for a new quest of some sort. But I had largely satiated my lust for those types of adventures with our exhausting trek around the Karakoram, and I wasn't very interested in a reprise. Then, after some point around 2018, I didn't hear from him at all anymore. At a certain point I became curious and tried to look him up on the internet. That was when I discovered the horrific newspaper article published in the Trieste Gazette. There could be little doubt that it was him. The name and location matched perfectly. Marco, it appeared, had committed suicide. But not by any ordinary method. He had swallowed 2 different virulent poisons, set himself on fire, and jumped from the 7th-story balcony of the apartment he was living in at the time. It was as if he really wanted to make sure he actually died. Either that, or he wanted to draw attention to his suicide, but that wouldn't explain him first taking 2 different poisons. It hardly seemed possible to me that Marco, of all people, would kill himself. I suppose it's true that you don't really know what's going on in a person's mind. People can present a front that covers up terrible despair. I hadn't even seen him face to face for 2 decades. It's just that he always seemed so full of life and plans that I couldn't picture him ending his own life, and in such a bizarre fashion. I decided on impulse to go to Trieste and try to find people who knew him, to see if I could get answers. I was due for a holiday, and Trieste seemed as good a place as any to go. By the time I got there, almost a year had passed since Marco's death. Trieste turned out to be a coastal city on a thin sliver of land that looked on the map as though it ought to belong to Slovenia, but Italy had acquired it at the end of the First World War. I managed to locate Marco's former apartment in a back street in one of the less salubrious areas of the town, and there I managed to get inside and take the lift to the 7th floor. The door was answered by a pale woman, considerably younger than Marco, smoking a cigarette. She had unkempt curly brown hair and was wearing what may have been Marco's dressing gown. Fortunately, she turned out to speak English quite well. I explained that I was a friend of Marco's and I apologised for disturbing her. When I told her my name, her eyes lit up with recognition. "I have something for you," she said. "He said to give it to you, but I didn't have your address. Come in." I followed her into the gloom of the apartment, and she presented me with a package about half the size of a shoebox. It had my name written on it in Marco's distinctive arabesque handwriting. "What is it?" I asked. "I have no idea and I don't want to know. All I know is he wanted you to have it. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself. I am Irina. Marco and I were together for 3 years." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. "Don't be," she replied. "He was crazy at the end. I don't know how we even ended up spending 3 years together, but for the last month I might as well have been living alone. Actually, that would have been much better." He wasn't his usual self. He wasn't mentally present at all. He took some drug that made him crazy. I don't know what it was. He wouldn't see a doctor. "Was he depressed?" I asked, feeling the question to be almost superfluous. Her answer surprised me. "Not at all, just crazy. He kept talking to himself in some weird language. I'm a linguist. Before I came here, I worked for many years at the university in Ljubljana. I'm certain he was babbling in a real language, but it wasn't like any language I've heard, and he developed a weird accent. He sounded like a foreigner when he spoke Italian. The drug must have damaged his long-term memory or messed up the language centres in his brain. It was a shock when he died, but to be honest, it was a relief also." We talked for perhaps half an hour and she made me some coffee, but I couldn't get anything more informative than that out of her. She seemed happy enough to talk to me. It seemed like her and Marco's relationship had been a relatively casual, on-off sort of a thing, and she had always regarded him as one card short of a full deck. I gathered that Marco had probably only got crazier since I had travelled with him all those years ago. His final craziness at the end had been too much for her. I was glad that at least I hadn't had to upset a grieving wife with my insensitive questions. I took the package back to my hotel room on a street in the old town near the sea and tore open the packaging. Inside was a wooden box, fabricated from an obscurely heavy wood and intricately inscribed with the flowing letters of a language I didn't recognise. The lid of the box sprang open easily on a hinge. Inside was a notebook, not very long or wide, but surprisingly thick. It was filled with tiny handwriting in English, written in Marco's easily recognisable handwriting. The notebook contained a strange story which I will present to you as is. I have removed only one small part, where Marco gives the location where he concealed the pillbox containing the rest of the drug. What to make of it, I don't know. It's either the final outpouring of a mind completely unhinged by an obscure drug of unknown origin, or it's true. If it's true, well, but it can't be true. Dearest Richard, it's been many years since we hiked the Kush, but I've often thought of you, my friend. Soon I mean to leave this crazy world, hopefully forever, and I've been trying to decide whether or not to tell someone about what happened, and if so, who. It all comes down to this. In all my travels I've met only one man who I think might be able to understand the whole thing, and that's you. What a crazy adventure we had together, amico mio. None of my adventures since then have been quite so crazy, except for this last one. This last adventure. You're probably not going to believe it, but if you don't, then neither will anyone else. Marco probably meant to flatter my judgment with this remark, but it sounded a bit like he was saying I was the most gullible person he'd ever known. Well, here goes. I've made many useful contacts over the years. I kept trying to find out more about the divine incense of the Sagathas. Maybe you've met Irina. She's fluent in 3 different ancient Indian languages, including Sanskrit. But the fact is there's only so much information about the incense in the ancient texts, and her knowledge didn't help much in the end. I decided to approach the question from a different angle. The Sagatha says anyone who inhaled the incense became obsessed with it, right? We assumed that was hyperbole, but what if it wasn't? What kind of a substance could have that effect on a person? I consulted chemists, neurologists and pharmacists, and that's how I eventually discovered Al-Hafiz. What to say of him? He's crazy. He's a genius. He knows more about incense than probably anyone, living or dead, and he's an expert chemist. I mean, world class. It took me 2 whole years to persuade him to meet me, but in the end he agreed. I sent him photographs from our time in the Kush, and that must have helped convince him I was genuine and worth his time. Al-Hafiz invited me to meet him at his home in Genoa. He was living in a house in a crazily narrow street. Genoa is full of them. Half the house seemed to have been converted into a lab. Actually, lab is the wrong word. It was as much like an opium den as a lab. There were all kinds of weird people hanging out in there. The air was thick with incense and smoke from various pipes, smoked by people sitting cross-legged on cushions on the floor. All kinds of ornate tapestries hung on the walls, and mixed in with all that, if you can believe it, were the apparatus of modern chemistry, glassware, an NMR machine, autoclaves, centrifuges. I've never seen anything like it. We sat in a quiet room and drank green tea for about an hour. Al-Hafiz was very interested to hear of our adventures 20 years ago, and about my research since then. I too have searched for the divine incense, he said. I also did not find it. Probably it's just a myth. These old religious texts, you can't rely on them. Otherwise, it could be that the secret is irretrievably forgotten. In spite of his negative view of the Sagathas, he filled in a lot of historical details that I didn't know, and told me that the incense is also referred to in the ancient book of Ayana, which mainly deals with death and the afterlife. He was happy to speculate on the possible chemistry of such an incense and its possible origin, if it ever existed at all. It was as our conversation drew to a close that he rose to his feet, saying, "I'd like to show you something that may be of interest." He produced a small wooden pillbox that opened via a to and fro twist of the lid. "It's a curious opening mechanism, is it not?" he said. "Let us say it is a kind of child-proof safety lid created by the indigenous peoples of the very region that fascinates you. Inside the box was a small, roughly shaped flattened sphere of some dark greenish waxy material. What is it? A drug. We have more of it, but not much more. The locals call it Kalamrityu. It translates to something like time voyage. We have so far tested it only on rats, but rats aren't able to tell us how it feels. Perhaps you could tell us. At the time I felt honoured. I thought Al-Hafiz saw me as a fellow scholar, a person whose opinion he valued. In retrospect, perhaps he saw me as a disposable junkie. What would I do with it? I asked. Eat it, he said. To judge by the rats, the effects take an hour to make themselves fully known and last for 2 hours. During that time you will probably sleep, but we believe it to be far more than a simple hypnotic. At least if the local legends are to be believed. But don't take it here, take it home and prepare yourself first. You must fast for a day before taking it. What is it made of? We don't know, he said. We can only say that it appears to contain a combination of a number of different rare alkaloids, presumably of plant origin. Take it home, think about it. There is no pressure. If you decide not to take it, you can return it to me. Of course, that crafty fox knew I wouldn't be able to resist. I, a man who had scoured the Karakoram for an addictive incense, and of course he wanted me to take it home. Better for him that way if I'd died. I don't believe the thing about fasting at all. I did as he asked and took the substance home with me. A week later I ate it when Irina was out at work. Instead of eating the whole thing, as Al-Hafiz no doubt intended, I ate only a quarter of it. Grazia a Dio that I did, or I doubt I will be writing this account now. For the first half hour I felt nothing. Then I began to feel a little sleepy, but only a little. I lay down on my bed and waited. Gradually I began to experience a sort of buzzing sensation, starting in my hands and feet and working its way towards my body. With my eyes closed I saw faint flickers and shadows, as if a dream was trying to emerge into my consciousness. And then, quite suddenly, around the 40-minute mark, I saw a clear vision of a city lying on a coastal plain. The city was quite unlike any city on Earth. It consisted of low to medium-sized buildings built of stone, and above it flew strange machines, sometimes carrying people. Trees and other large plants of unearthly saturated shades of green, a deep brownish orange and purple, grew in between the buildings, and everything had the appearance of being well tended and harmonious. I could see no roads, only paths where people strolled. The appearance of the city as a whole was beautiful beyond compare. The vision lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was extremely clear and distinct. It was as if, for a split second, I was actually there, but perhaps in a heightened state of awareness, watching the city from some high vantage point in the hills. I opened my eyes and the room appeared perfectly as normal, except I saw everything with sharpened clarity, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. That was the last thing I remember of this world before the drug seized hold of me. The next thing I knew, I was lying in what looked like an alpine meadow, except the vegetation was oddly unfamiliar. I had no doubt at all that I was actually there, and I had no idea how I could have got there. The only thing I could think of was that Al-Hafiz had been secretly watching me and had broken into my house and taken me there while I was sleeping due to the effects of the drug. But that made no sense. Why would he do that? And then I started to wonder if I was dead. Perhaps this was the afterlife. I got to my feet and started to follow a path that led down the hill. In the other direction lay the summit of a small mountain, and I had no desire to go there. After perhaps 20 minutes of walking steadily downwards on a gradual slope, a spectacular view opened up in front of me. In the distance, the blue ocean stretched to the horizon. Before that, the same city that I had already seen. Now, it would be fair to say that I was surprised. The city clearly did not exist, I thought. Yet, at the same time, I was clearly standing on a hill looking at it. I was quite sure I wasn't dreaming. Everything felt completely real. I could bend down and pick a flower and twirl it by the stem in my fingers. I could feel the wind against my face. I was really there. The only way I could account for it is that either this was some secret, technologically advanced experimental city that had somehow been hidden from the rest of the world, or else I was hallucinating the city, but the rest was all real. I continued to make my way down the path towards it, and eventually I came upon a truly weird thing, if the city wasn't already weird enough. The path abruptly ended. Some railings fenced off a steep slope, almost a cliff, marking a viewpoint from which the city, the surrounding hills and the ocean could be taken in while sitting on a bench. Over to the side, a green light circled constantly around a low platform made of some dull grey stone. On the platform stood a thing that looked somewhat like a motorbike, except it had no wheels. The green light was clearly intended to draw attention to it. Since I could find no route down the hill, eventually I decided to sit on the thing and see if perhaps it sprouted wheels. Upon pressing what I took to be an ignition button, it sprang gently into the air and hovered, with me sitting on it. I knew very well that no technology like that existed on Earth, unless kept strictly secret. Still, I thought perhaps there were magnets in the bike and the platform, and the whole contraption was part of some elaborate joke being played on me. I had to change my mind when I discovered the bike easily moved off the platform with a gentle forward pressure on the handlebars and glided silently down the hill. With very little practice I was able to control it fully. It seemed capable of flying at any height, although I was afraid to rise more than a few meters from the steeply sloping hillside. After perhaps 10 minutes I arrived at the city. The first person I saw there welcomed me with a shout and a hearty wave. "Where am I?" I asked. "Frith," he replied. "You're home. Welcome back." I haven't time or space to write down even a millionth of the things that happened to me after that, nor, being honest, the inclination. I must stick to the essentials. There are things that you need to know, even if you won't believe me. It turned out that Frith was the name of the entire planet, not just the city. Frith is a real planet and exists in a galaxy far from that of the Earth's. I was given everything I needed there, and more besides. I lived happily on Frith for over 5,000 years. I took a wife there, and over the years she gave birth to 14 children, and they grew up and had children themselves. I visited other planets and moons. Many happy hours we whiled away on the small planet of Korkoma, which is covered entirely in gigantic luminous mushrooms the size of trees, and populated by small furry animals that live happily in the stems of the mushrooms. Sometimes too we visited the nearby planet of Shahar, where one may see vast cities filled with ancient spires and volcanoes that spew cold blue lava. Can you imagine spending 5,000 years away from home? I know what you will think. This was nothing but a drug-inspired delusion, a crazed fantasy. Imagine for a moment that you are incorrect, my friend. I built a life on Frith, equivalent to very many human lifetimes. Frith is far, far more real to me now than the Earth. This life here on Earth seems to me nothing now but a silly dream. The sheer length and variety of the experience I had, supposedly under the influence of a drug, alone compels me to view that experience as reality, and this experience on Earth as hardly more than a fantasy. And yet I returned. Why? The people of Frith created the Earth as a sort of reform school or prison. If you commit a serious crime on Frith, they somehow detach your mind from your body and send it to Earth in the form of a fetus. The detachment process erases your memory completely, but you're still the same person. It's still you that has the whole experience and not someone else. When you die on Earth, you arrive back into your old body on Frith, which they carefully maintain in your absence, and you regain your former memories. The moment they see a body beginning to awaken, they transport it to a meadow in the hills to give it a pleasant awakening. The drug that Al-Hafiz discovered short-circuits the whole process. It wakes you up artificially, without you having died. When it wears off, your body on Frith, or wherever it happens to be, will simply collapse, and you'll awaken in your Earth body again. The people of Frith consider the drug highly immoral because they believe that only by living out life to the end on Earth can we criminals learn our lesson and be properly reformed. Even so, they are powerless to stop it. Essentially, it allows you to take a holiday from your prison sentence. You can't imagine what it's like to live for thousands of years in places of enormous beauty, to leave behind hundreds of descendants, to be free of all cares and anxieties, only to return to the Earth again and face the monstrous conditions that prevail here. Well, there it is, Richard, and I want out as soon as I can arrange it. Yours, Marco. Marco's story left me with many questions, and the questions were of two types. Firstly, I wanted to know more about his life on Frith, although I don't for a moment think any of the story was real. What crime had he supposedly committed there? What crime had I committed, since according to the story I too must be a criminal? And what would happen to his body on Frith when his mind returned to the Earth? I suppose the people of Frith in this fantasy would administer medical assistance immediately and wait for him to die on the Earth and return to Frith. Secondly, I had questions about the undoubted reality of the situation. Did Marco himself believe his own story? If not, how to account for his flamboyant suicide? What kind of nightmarish drug could cause a person to think they've lived for thousands of years in the space of a few hours? Was Al-Hafiz even real? There was an obvious way to check his story. He had specified the location where he had hidden the remnant of the substance. It was a cave in Trieste, one that few knew about, and the box was stashed near a certain rock formation. I went there the very next day and found the pillbox, just as he had said. It opened with a double twist of the lid, and inside was a small blob of a dark green substance, with a quarter of it carefully cut off. It sits now on a desk in the hotel room in front of me. I could take a tiny amount, I suppose, a 16th or a 32nd of it. My hand reaches out, trembling. I cut off a piece with my pocket knife. I bring it to my lips. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like and subscribe buttons and give all your possessions to charity, including your clothes if you're wearing any, and spectacles. It really helps me when you do that.